We've been exploring how the majority of English colonists came to America in Virginia and then a little bit later in New England. In 1607, Jamestown, and then Plymouth, 1620. And those are really the main focus of colonization studies when we talk about early American history. But there were quite a few other colonies that were developed shortly after the coming to Virginia and to New England. And that's what we want to look at this point. It wasn't English people, but in 1624, the Dutch, who had heard and they had actually interacted with the Pilgrims who came to Plymouth when the Pilgrims had stopped over in Holland, the Dutch decided they too wanted to come to America, and they came right in between New England and Virginia to a place called what they called New Amsterdam. And New Amsterdam had been divided up into a number of boroughs by the Dutch, and we'll come back to that piece. Peter Minuit was the one who came to what we call today Manhattan Island and allegedly purchased the island from the Native Americans for something like $24 of English cents in terms of beads. We also know that the natives probably didn't understand that as a real estate deal because the Indians didn't have the same concept of real estate ownership that the Europeans had. And so as a result of the attacks of Indians that later occurred on the island of Manhattan, the natives built a wall to defend themselves from Indian attacks, and the residue of that wall, or what is left of the wall, is the street that went around the side of the wall, which today is still called Wall Street, a very important part of Manhattan Island. Well, the Dutch broke the area up, New Amsterdam up, into several different boroughs. One was called Harlem, one called Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, Staten Island, and Manhattan. And it was a very cosmopolitan place. Believe it or not, in the 17th century, New Amsterdam had Jews, had Muslims, also known at the time as Turks. They had something like 18 different languages spoken in New Amsterdam in the 17th century. New Amsterdam remained under the control of the Dutch until 1660, when Charles II, the Stuart king, was restored to the throne. At that point, he looked at the map, he saw all the English colonies all around the east coast of America, and then this one little Dutch colony right in the center, and he said, we're not going to leave it that way. We're going to give those Dutch an opportunity to basically concede their jurisdiction to us and let them live, or if they want to have a war, we can do that as well. Well, the Dutch simply ceded their jurisdiction to the Stuart family in England, and New Amsterdam became an English colony, named now for its new proprietor, the brother of the king, James of York, from New Amsterdam to New York. Now, when we talk about a colony just to the south of New York, we're looking at what was called at the time New Sweden. New Sweden had been established by Swedish people, obviously, and remained under their control until 1655, when the Dutch actually annexed New Sweden. And then when the Dutch were annexed by the King of England, Charles II, Stuart, and his brother James, then the whole area became English colony. So although there was at one time Swedes and Dutch in the center of the American colonies, by 1660 they had all been annexed by the English throne. Now we talk about the proprietary colonies. Proprietary colonies are those where a particular person was the landlord of the entire colony, and the people who lived there would pay that person as a tenant. They paid rent to live in their colony. The first and the most famous of the proprietary colonies was established by George Calvert, also known as Lord Baltimore. He was a Catholic, and he was concerned during the time of unrest between Charles I Stuart and the Puritans that the Catholics may end up becoming the most oppressed of all people in England. So he asked for land from Charles I that might serve as a Catholic refuge. Charles I gave him what we call Maryland, and then he started to accept tenants. What was interesting, most of his tenants were not Catholic, and they grew so strongly that they eventually overthrew George Calvert until he established in 1649 a Toleration Act that said it doesn't matter what you believe, you're welcome in the state of Maryland, the Toleration Act 1649. Another proprietor is William Penn. His story is quite an interesting one. His father was an Admiral William Penn, and his father was owed a debt by the old King of England, Charles I. When Charles I had his head cut off, William Penn Jr. still had the receipt for what his father had owed him. He had served in as an admiral in the British Navy and was owed money. So when Charles II was restored to the throne, William Penn Jr. went to him with the receipt and said, "Wow, your dad owed my dad, and I'm here to collect." But he had a new idea. He didn't want gold or silver. William Penn Jr. had joined the radical sect known as the Society of Friends, also the Quakers. And they were oppressed and arrested and persecuted on every side. So instead of gold, William Penn asked the king for land in the New World in America. And in fact, he was given that instead of the gold, instead of the silver. He was given a huge multi-million acre forest. The forest in Latin is Sylvania. So he was given the area known as Pennsylvania. And he went there with a good number of his buddies and established a colony or a city known as the City of Brotherly Love. The Greek word for brotherly love is Philadelphia. Philos means love, Adelphia is a brother, the City of Brotherly Love. And as Quakers, they were not only tolerant of one another, they were tolerant of every religion. Philadelphia became a place where all kinds of outsiders, all kinds of people who were oppressed would come and be safe and feel comfortable. They even had great treaties with the Indians early on in Philadelphia. The last set of colonies are those colonies to the south of Virginia. Charles II was quite interested in continuing to colonize, particularly those areas where you could grow cash crops, indigo, which is for ink, cotton, rice, things of that nature could be grown very well in those areas south of Virginia, and those areas were given Charles' name. Now, the Latin name for Charles is Carolus, and so those regions are called the Carolinas. And the principal city, the principal colony, was called Charleston in what is today South Carolina. They did so much with cash crops, they needed so many slaves, they needed so many laborers, that there were more blacks living in the Carolina than there were whites. There were a few refugees from France, the Huguenots that came, but Charlestown became the centerpiece of the Carolinas. And the author of the Constitution of Carolina was none other than John Locke, that famous Enlightenment political philosopher who gave us the social contract theory and the theory beneath the Declaration of Independence. The final colony was not established until way later in the 18th century, when a man by the name of General James Oglethorpe was looking to establish a colony that would serve kind of as a buffer between Charleston, which is in South Carolina, a colony of planters and great wealth, and the colony of Florida, which was inhabited by Spaniards. And there was a great possibility that those two could end up in some kind of military battle situation. Well, Oglethorpe was willing to settle a colony in between those two, the colony of Georgia, named for the new Hanover king, the one who couldn't even speak English, George Hanover, who was there basically based on his cousinry to the former Stuart kings and queens. But Georgia was established, and Oglethorpe welcomed many people who were in debtor's prison to come to Georgia to serve as a military buffer between Florida and the Carolinas. And so Georgia was established not by these wealthy planters, as you would have in Virginia or in the Carolina, but perhaps the lower class of sorts. And that colony didn't begin until the 1730s.